Hi, I'm Anne and I write things. And today I wanted to kind of do an outline. So this is an outline I actually did a while ago, and then I was looking at the footage like many months ago and maybe just like a couple months ago, and I realized that like some of the footage was completely unusable because all of the audio had just messed up. It was just like beeping, and I was trying a lot of new things with this and none of them went well. So we're like reworking this, so I'm only doing like one new thing instead of like 20, which I think is probably a safer bet. You know, improvement is a slow process. But I did an outline like a few months ago, and I was doing it to kind of like, it was while I was writing Project Underground and I was feeling really confused about like romance. It was while I was really just like, what is it I see in like books and stuff that I view as romance, right? Like, what is that? It's kind of like this strange amorphous thing. And so I wanted to kind of like look into that and see what it was like on sort of a big picture level. What are the things that make me like want to root for these characters? Like, as the writer, I root for these characters because I designed them. I made it so their interactions were something that I personally would root for, but I don't understand that, and I didn't understand any of the like details or anything. So I went and I outlined something that I had no real intention of writing, and I still don't really intend to write it, but it was a really fun process and really helpful to me just to kind of like process how I see romance. You probably won't see my face for the rest of this video, just as like a heads up. I'm going to be invisible and with a different mic, so we'll see how that works out actually. And if it's weird, you know, just ignore it, it's fine. I decided to outline a contemporary romance, and I wanted to do something with really simple, a really big premise, something I didn't have to think too much about. So it's a sapphic mafia romance. Since this whole like thing is very chaotic, and like the writing process and the outline, well, not the writing process, but the outlining process got so chaotic. So I was looking through it, and I don't think there's genuinely any way to really explain it like step by step, because I don't follow any structure. I don't follow anything. I basically just follow my instincts throughout it. So yeah, I don't know if there's any structure, but I made a cute little like blurb which is very rough, but I think it should give some sort of idea of what's going on and what the plan is. And then I'll explain a little bit about like the steps I take. And if you're curious about the details, I'll like show them to you while we're going. I'm also probably just gonna ramble a lot about the story and like how it comes into fruition and stuff. But anyways, here's the blurb. Iris has a half-finished degree and a hole in her bank account. But when her life becomes intertwined with notorious crime boss Lila, her worries shift from where to find her next meal to escaping this compelling madwoman. Leaving isn't so easy though, not when Lila's enemies turn on Iris, and now they have to work together to find the mastermind behind the attacks or die trying. It doesn't hurt that they have more in common than Iris expected, or that Iris never felt more free than when they're chained together. But Iris has never had the luxury of choice, and survival always takes more luck than skill. So that's that's the blurb. I always like writing blurbs because they give you a sense of the character arc, which like, I don't know, it tells me personally the emotional core of the story, which is fun. Even if it's not necessarily a great blurb, it's helpful. So as you can tell from that, this is a mafia boss like book. We're going into mafia territory, and it's like a romance. It's very much like it's a contemporary romance, but I start with this by just sort of brainstorming. I did some thinking about this story before I actually started outlining it, so a lot of this stuff is more well thought out in the beginning than as I start getting through it. But in the beginning, I kind of think about like what do I like about these mafia stories? What are the compelling bits of it to me personally? And one of those compelling bits to me is sort of power fantasy, and it's similar to why I really like Fruits Basket and One Punch Man, if you know those. It's sort of like these characters who are just being themselves and existing in this world, and just by virtue of being themselves they're like helping other people. And for me, mafia boss romance is kind of a subset of that genre. Another thing I like is the saving aspect of it. I always like it when people are hurt and there has to be comfort. So I start with these two characters, which is where a lot of like brainstorming for me, like the important bits are. If I have like a big picture plot going on, then I can create the characters that will give me that big picture plot. But it's easier for me when I start with the characters and I kind of have an idea of what their arc is. So we have Iris, who is like this poor student who doesn't really like have a great relationship with her parents. She's recently been kind of cut off from them, most likely because of like some really small silly things she did that shouldn't be a big deal but is turned into a big deal because her parents are very controlling and they kind of wield money as a way of like power. And Iris was sort of like, I'll just ride it through until I get my degree and then I can deal with it and move on. But as with most things where you have like a family punching bag, when that punching bag leaves, the family kind of dissolves a bit and desperately tries to bring the punching bag back because they don't know how to deal with their own issues without like taking out on someone else. So Iris is very personable. She's really good with other people, but she also cannot retain friendships because she just doesn't know how, and there's a lot of mistrust in that. Lila is sort of the opposite of that. Lila is not very personable. She's kind of like abrupt, a little aggressive, but she is extremely loyal. So she's kind of like surrounded by people who she's very loyal to and she really trusts a lot. But they both have issues with their family, which is like a thing that they can bond over. I kind of had to decide why Lila became the mafia boss, and it could have been a lot of different things, but I decided to go the route of like her dad was the previous like crime boss, and so Lila took over after he died, and he was killed in sort of like a really intense, violent way, as happens with crime. And so like she naturally took over, but she doesn't really want to be the mafia boss. She kind of took it over as like a lack of anything else. Like she felt responsible for the people within her, you know, view within her stuff. She felt responsible for the other people. She wanted to take care of them. So she sort of stuck around for that reason, which is really interesting. But she also has a brother, and she spent most of her life kind of growing up doing things specifically to protect her brother from their dad. And in doing that, she sort of created a wedge between her and her brother because she became more and more like her dad in order to both appease him and use that power to protect her brother. And so like they have a very, very rocky relationship, and that's something that like Lila desperately wishes was better but doesn't know how to fix it. And so now that I've done like the basic brainstorming, I have an idea of where I want the story to go now, right? Before all of this, I kind of had this idea for this meet cute between the two of them where like one of them saves the other. And I end up deciding to go with like they both save each other, and there's like this shootout, and Iris is just wrong place, wrong time, and she gets dragged into this whole mess. So I put that down as like this is what's going to happen. The meet cute in this book is where you invest in their banter. They would have really silly banter. I've written out some little bits of their banter, which is really fun, and like I need to introduce them first. So I have these like intros, but I also immediately know where Lila's story is going, right? Like I know where I want that to go because she wants to heal the relationship with her brother and like, you know, move forward from like her past and like all of this stuff that happened with her dad. And so her end goal is basically her leaving the mafia, basically passing it down. And I was like, you know, maybe she could leave it with like this big dramatic thing where it's just like she leaves and she crashes it down behind her. But I kind of had this idea of like this silly side character, which absolutely does not show up in the outline at all. But I had this idea of this kind of like silly side character that's very irreverent, and I was like, it would be fun if she gave it to him. This would be hilarious to have a mafia boss series where every single book ends with the mafia boss leaving the mafia, and then the last one would probably, it would be given to someone who's really, really not a good fit for it, who would just burn it all to the ground, which I think would be so funny. After I figure out kind of where Lila's story is going, it makes a lot more sense to me to do the intro. I kind of know where I want this to go, whether like what parts of her character arc we really need to introduce for like the arc to really feel satisfying. So I introduce her, and then I go and I try to figure out like, who is Iris? I don't know why, but she's a little harder for me to grasp. How Iris interacts with the world and the way that she thinks is so foreign foreign to me. Like, I really don't understand it. Like, who is she? What does she want? Where does she go? Like, what are the details? I know the big picture things, but I don't really know the details. So in order to kind of figure that out, I do this a lot of times with characters I don't feel like I understand, but I go ahead and I write a little snippet of just her introduction. Not really her introduction. This is not anything that would belong in the story. This is just something that is meant to tell me a bit about the characters. Like, there's no point in this specific like snippet of writing, but it's really important for me personally to kind of understand where the character is going, like what she thinks, like what's her thought process. And so like when we look at it, we can kind of like read through it and we can see that she's very particular about things. Like, she keeps everything in place. And though she lives in kind of like a cheap rundown place, a cheap rundown location, she makes it so that things still feel homey. There may be holes in the wall and stains on the floor that were there before she came there, but she still like covers them with like mats and stuff she got at the thrift store. She still like makes an effort to make her space clean and like, you know, a good place to be for her, which I think is really interesting. And she also has some internality. I don't know what that word is, but she has some thoughts about her parents and her siblings, and like the way she feels about them is this really like torn apart thing, and you can see how raw the leaving feels to her right now. And I think that's really valuable, and that gives me a lot of ideas for what her character arc would be. Doing that was very helpful. It gives me an idea of what her introduction actually should be and what sort of stuff we should introduce for her, which is, I think, is good. And it also gives me an idea of where to go from there. So after finishing kind of like the beginning parts and the later parts, like the beginning and the ending, I have this idea of like where I want their relationship to go, and now that I know their issues, I can kind of think about like where they'll interact and what sort of like problems they'll run into. So I come up with a realization of what is going to happen around the middle of this story, which is like where Iris's issues really get the best of her. So Iris like begins to trust Lila, but then freaks out about it, and there's like this whole follow through that happens with that because she has those trust issues and she doesn't let people close. So when she gets a little bit too close with Lila, she's like, ah no, I'm good. How did she get close? I don't know yet, but we'll get to that eventually. And then after I come up with this, I can like add a little bit of like things that might happen later. I often will just have like full reaction bars just of like, this is what they'll be feeling at this point, this is what's gonna happen. Like, not necessarily physical actions, just like this is the emotional place that they are. Then I just kind of like keep filling it in from there. Because I had this sense of like where the middle of this book will end up, I just keep going on. I keep following like the train of like, this happened, so then this has to happen because this follows this and this follows this. And so I just keep going down that path. This is where I'm like, okay. So at some point, I'm like, we need to have an actual plot. Like, we know in the beginning that like Lila is in some issues. There was like a shootout or something. And like Iris and Lila were both in danger, and that Iris has been pulled into this. So like, what is this thing? What is this thing that's like actually been causing these, you know, issues? I have to bring that back into it. So I start bringing that back in around here. Maybe there was like a perpetrator that's caused all of these terrible things. Like maybe someone within the ranks, maybe something else. Because they've separated, maybe Iris makes a connection and they like separate, and then Lila goes off, but Lila's just in danger constantly. And so Iris has to return because saving Lila is more important than her like emotional baggage. They have to figure this all out. And in the terms of the actual like story, I actually change a lot of these parts like towards the end, like after the fact, not actually while I'm writing this outline. But something kind of hit me wrong about this second separation. After Lila gets saved, right? Lila is devastated, she's angry, she's all of these things. So they get separated again. And this makes a little less sense, but a lot of the reason why I felt like they needed to separate, and honestly why I still kind of feel like they need a bit of outside thoughts. Like they become very codependent throughout this, and that's sort of what their character arcs and their characterizations would end up being. Especially Lila. Lila wants to replace the codependence she felt with her brother onto like Iris and onto someone else. Like she wants to feel that dedication to someone else again. Not necessarily healthy, but they both have things to work through. At this point, I have them separate and all that stuff, but I do think that that's not necessarily like 100% what would make sense for the character, because the thing is, they're not the same characters they were in the beginning, right? Like the way that the ideation phase happened. Like Lila wants to be better, and like before she didn't really know how, but now that she has this betrayal that has happened, she gets really angry about it. And she allows that anger to push her through to being someone she likes, which I think is really powerful. But there's still like a separation scene, but it's like more like, hey girl, I'm gonna go and leave the mafia, and I will come back when it's safe, because obviously leaving the mafia is not like an easy thing to do. At least I assume not. But yeah, so she leaves the mafia, and that's sort of like where it comes on from here. Initially I was like, there's gonna be this whole thing where they get separated and there's like apologies, and I'm like, there really doesn't need to be that. We can really have their character arcs sort of like come together at the very end during the scene where her life is in danger, and like she comes to all these realizations. Also, that would be such a fun scene to write, jumping back and forth where like Lila is like walking around with the person who wants her dead, and then Iris is like desperately running to try to save her, and Lila has no idea. And yeah, I think that would just be hilarious, especially if Iris was already on the way home, and then you could just jump back and forth, and it's just like, it would be really fun to write. Now that we've kind of figured out the ending and where it's gonna go, like we have to figure out what actually is going on throughout, right? So after that, I sort of jump back to the beginning and I just start filling in things. Like I start filling out like wherever there's sort of these empty spaces on my like little cards, I just start filling stuff in. And that's why I like having a lot of extras if I feel like there's going to be stuff there that I don't know about yet, because it really helps with knowing where to jump to. They sort of just go through and they start building their relationship, and I start writing more of those details and sort of like how they build that. Like initially they have a very contentious relationship, right? Because Iris feels like she's been kidnapped by this, you know, crime boss, this like notorious crime boss. And she's like, how dare you, leave me alone. And Lila is very controlling because she feels like she has to be, you know, from her growing up and also being the boss of the mafia. And so Iris is just like, I want to get out, I want to be free, and so she like wants to be involved in figuring out who's doing this stuff. I was thinking about having her have a degree, like a half-finished degree in like botany, but I also think it'd be really fun to have her have a half-finished degree in like forensic science or something, just so that she can feel like she has skills and all these things to really help with the whole process, you know what I mean? And I think that would be interesting. That would create a lot of details about like what would happen. Maybe they would have to sneak in with like fingerprints or something, and maybe they did it wrong. I think that would be so fun. For now, we just kind of like go on. See, this is sort of like, this outline is very general. You know, it's all about like what steps they take, and a lot of details would probably like would be added during the actual, you know, writing of this. A lot of things would change and grow. Things evolve, you know? At least for me, things evolve a lot. Lila takes Iris on mafia business. There's a lot of realizations from Iris that maybe Lila isn't as bad as she thought, but there's obviously like a lot of, you know, violence being in crime. And so I want that to be very clear too. There's like an attempt on Iris's life, and then we have a whole bunch of other things that just sort of like fall in, and we figure out the hints about maybe there's a villain and hints to who that is. Like throughout this, I think it takes me a while to actually figure out who the villain is. Like, who is this person who's like betraying the main character? And I realized at some point, like after saying like, hey, there's some hints on who the villain is, and then we also have a rival gang acting up to kind of muddy the waters a bit, right? And like, I want there to be some interesting development between like Iris and Lila with the rival gang, and like Lila's still trying to protect Iris the way she tries to protect her brother, which is not a great plan. because it's more like infantilizing in a lot of ways. And also Lila is controlling and she needs to like get rid of that. She needs to figure out how to like deconstruct that from herself if she wants to like actually have a relationship with her brother, which is her main goal. Like having a relationship with her brother is her main goal, which initially she thinks she can only do through more control. The truth of how she becomes closer with her brother is she releases that control a bit and lets her brother kind of like decide what he wants. She leaves it open to like let it happen. But Iris doesn't really take this well because like she just escaped her parents, and even though they kind of left her high and dry, it's like she's like happier being without them than she ever was with them. And so Iris is just not going to take this anymore. And I think that's also a huge part of Iris's like arc, is her just like growing into her own self and growing into her own independence, like coming out of any sort of like toxic relationship or abuse or anything like that. It can really feel like you have to rediscover yourself because there are so many ways that we twist and change ourselves to fit what someone wants us to be, especially if the reaction is like anger or punishment in any sort of way. So Iris is having some really interesting thoughts about this stuff. I also like make sure to take notes of like what sort of, you know, romantic stuff might happen during all these points and like what realizations they come to, because that's really important. And a lot of why I really wanted to write this outline was to explore what romance is. I also have some scenes and some points of them talking about their parents and like Iris's parents and Lila's parents and her brother. And they just like have a lot of like these interactions that really, you know, start building into something more. They start seeing more of each other. They start really understanding like what's going on like throughout all of this. And they can't really leave each other, so they're forced to kind of be civil. And it's like they've worn away a lot of the edges of each other. And so we have things going on. They have a lot of like chats and good stuff and bonding. And we probably have a lot of close calls. I think even more close calls than it says inside of there. Just in terms of like how their relationship will progress. Jump around a little bit. Sometimes I have more ideas about like what the main plot will be, and sometimes I'll have more ideas about what the romance will be, and I kind of like jump back and forth. So it just keeps going. One of the people that Lila trusts a lot, who was there and like the right-hand man of her dad, thinks that Lila was involved in the death of the dad. And so that's a huge, like that's what the whole like, that's the villain of this. And so he's basically working with the rival gang in order to like try to get them to like muddy the waters and also just take out hopefully like Lila without him having to worry about it, right? But with Iris there, it makes her a lot more cautious about everything. So that's a huge thing that happens. We also add some like cute scenes where they're gonna go off and like adventure through like Iris's life. They like go through to her college, and there'll probably be some like fun realizations about what her life is like, and I think that'd be fun. I think it would create a sense of empathy between the two characters. A lot of these scenes would just kind of happen, you know, as they go on. And then there's a scene where they like get together and there's like an awkward morning after, because I think that would be really fun. And I think it makes sense for their characters. And then we have like the realization of like who they think is the bad person. They're wrong. But it would be fun to have like key elements and make a match with the other people. And then after that, it just leads into what we already know. And then I just go back and I'll add some like little bits to different parts of the scene to be like, oh, now that I know this, we can just add this stuff and all that stuff. After this is kind of just like the fun itty bitty stuff. And like I don't always outline out of order. Oftentimes I'll just outline in order, especially if I'm really stuck. Because like if I'm really stuck, then I can just like go in order and like understand more of the main character's like arc. But if I understand the character's arc, it's a lot easier for me to jump around because that's my like touchstone points, right? So if you notice, when I first started, I started at like figuring out the characters' arcs, and then I went directly to the end where I could like fix up their character arcs, and then I went to the middle where like we would have some sort of crossover and change in their main character arcs, and then the rest sort of like fell, and I just had to like add all the little extra stuff. Like the plot in this one came last, But if I'm really confused about the character arcs and the character journeys, which like happens, it is fine. Or if I don't know how they're gonna end, if I don't have a clear view of that, I find that outlining in order is a lot more useful for me, because then I do have a plot. Typically, I have one or the other. And then if I go in order with a plot, I can just do this and this and this and sort of explore the character arc that way. I don't usually outline this intensely. Sometimes I do, but like normally I outline very little. And I've actually just recently realized that I was over world building something, not even outlining, just world building, and it was changing the story I wanted to write. So I've scrapped all that world building. But anyways, this was very chaotic and very all over the place, but I hope you enjoyed it. We'll send you to the outro, people, now, because this outline is done temporarily. Hello, so I'm back, but this is, yeah, anyways, you're just gonna have to deal with my wet hair. It doesn't really matter, but I just wanted to end this video because it's over, I guess. I didn't realize how, like, vulnerable it is to, like, share something like that, even if it's just, like, an outline of something I'm not really gonna write, just because I have too many ideas, and this was really just for personal, like, learning, I guess. But it's been really fun. It was so much fun to do the outline. It was so much fun to think about it and to, like, really get invested in these characters. And I had, like, dreams for days after about this, and it was just really fun. And also, coming back to this, I'm realizing how absolutely chaotic and difficult, like, it will be to actually follow what's going on in that video. But it makes sense, because that's, like, how I generally outline. You know, there's so much in the outline that I know would change with the process of writing it. Like, there's a lot of pieces that would just adjust and switch in order to better, like, suit the actual story. Not to mention how much it would change in edits, right? Because then I would know more and have a better understanding. And I think that's just part of the fun. Like, that's just part of the fun about the whole writing process, is seeing these, like, sort of rough, raw ideas really evolve and change, and I think it's fun. It was fun doing that. And I hope that you guys have enjoyed watching it. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day,